I've seen you, and I know you're out there working on this. And while many people are focused on, and there's a bit of a debate, a kerfuffle, if you will, over Syrian refugees, you've brought up another issue that you think is maybe a little more pressing, at least when it comes to security. Tell us a little bit about this visa program and maybe why it should be more concerning than refugees.
Right. Well, the refugee program, we ought to obviously make sure that the vetting is appropriate and fulsome and robust, and frankly, in my view, it is. It's a long process for some Syrian refugee to come to the United States. The Obama administration has done a pretty poor job explaining what that is, and they've kind of let this hysteria go around. And I don't blame governors and others for taking measures to protect citizens of their states. But as far as what we need to worry about, that in my list, that's down a ways. You have political asylees, you have regular visas that are issued, student visas, tourist visas, that we have a far, less robust vetting process for.
Senator Flake, can you explain to me the visa waiver program or,
sure,
or the concern?
Right, and what I'm speaking about isn't even the visa waiver program. Right. The visa waiver program, there are 39 countries around the world with whom we have good relationships, and these countries have agreed to take certain security measures. And it includes most of those countries, most of the 39 are in Western Europe. Anybody in the European Union does not need to get a visa to come to the United States. If they have a valid passport from any of their respective countries, they can come to the United States for up to 90 days. And so those are real vulnerabilities, particularly when you realize that the terrorists in France were mostly homegrown. They had French or Belgian passports. And so unless there was something else that would trigger some kind of check on their passport, then they could travel to the United States basically at will. It turns out that some of these were on our no-fly list for some other reason, which begs the question, why didn't the French watch them a little more closely? But we need to make sure that people, particularly in Europe, who are traveling frequently to Iraq or Syria, have to go through a better process than we have right now to come to the United States.
So what are you proposing right now with the waiver system and the visa system?
Senator Feinstein and I are introducing legislation to, at a minimum, require that any European any person from these European countries with whom we have a visa waiver arrangement, if they travel to Iraq or Syria in the last 5 years, they would not be eligible for visa waiver. And it's not to say that they couldn't travel to the United States, but they would have to go through a vetting process like anybody who applies for a visa does.
So, in other words, and I think this makes rational sense, and I credit you, Senator Flake, seriously, and I saw you talking about it this morning because I think that is, the idea that somebody is going to, a terrorist is going to go through the refugee program, live in some UN shelter for 2 years, be interviewed by the FBI and Homeland Security so they can get in the United States, I find a little ludicrous when you understand that some of these French terrorists that committed this horrific attack last Friday might have been able to come here and land at Dulles Airport or JFK and just say, hey, we're here to see the sights, and we would let them in this country because of this waiver program. That strikes me as a gaping gap in security.
It is, and I think that we need to address that. Now, I think when people look at the refugee program, people in the U.S. may think, well, this is similar to what European countries are experiencing with floods, coming across and little vetting that can take place just because of the circumstances. We have a big ocean between, the Middle East and the U.S., and so we're able to go through a much longer process, a much more thorough process, and anybody who's arriving now, that vetting process started, 18 24 months ago, and only about 2% of the 2,000 Syrian refugees who arrived in the U.S. last year, for example, only about 2% were kind of military-age men, not affiliated with other family members. The kind of the profile that we ought to be worried about. And so I bet the Obama administration just has not done a good job explaining how our refugee program works, and so I think it's helped feed some of the concern that's out there.
We're speaking right now to Senator Jeff Flake on the KTAR Newsmaker line, live from Washington, D.C. And Senator, let's talk about that fear that you just touched upon, because most Americans right now, according to a Bloomberg poll, want the U.S. to stop letting in Syrian refugees. In fact, 53% of U.S. adults in this survey say that we should stop with this program. Only 28% say that we should keep it the way it is right now. What do you want to say to those folks, in particular those Arizonans who are part of that 53%?
Like I said, I don't blame anybody for having concerns, and there are certain gaps, I think, in the I should say gaps, but concerns that I have. For example, those in the refugee program that come now are required within a year to seek LPR status, or legal permanent resident status, which would necessitate other background checks to see what they've been doing over the past year and whatever else. We don't do that. We have the requirement on the books, but DHS does not follow through. So that's a concern that I have. So I'm not saying that we don't need to make changes to the refugee program, but to have a halt or a stop to it, I think that's not necessary at this point. We ought to go through the vetting process like we are, but I think that we ought to remain a country that accepts true refugees, and I think that really is what we're all about.
Yeah,
and there have been some concerns, or some people saying also that we should accept just Christian refugees and not Muslim refugees. And I don't think that we want to get in a position where we're having a religious test for people that we bring into the country.
Yeah, I wholeheartly agree with that. Now, Senator Flake, is it necessary? We talk about there is a process in place, and these processes do exist, but the concern is that they're being short-circuited, or that they're being not followed. Does this require legislation to force them to do the job that's on the books?
I'll look at on the back end, what I mentioned in terms of how we check. All we really have is anecdotal evidence of how these refugees are doing, after they arrive, because we don't do a very good job checking. And so that may require legislation. But in terms of the vetting, the interviews that are done, the biographical and biometric requirements that are already there, I don't think it will require legislation. But we obviously have been having hearings already, 2 yesterday in a classified setting, and we'll have more as well. And if there are things that we need to tighten up, we will. But like I said, of the list of things that we ought to be concerned about, this is well down the list in terms of our vulnerabilities out there.
Senator Flake, thank you very much for joining us this morning and explaining more about this, and a voice of sanity and some rationality right now with all of the partisan political bickering. Someone who says, guys, here's what we should really be concerned about.
Yeah, but I think that the Senator